There is something strange about Family Guy. Not the obvious kind of strange. Not the kind that comes from watching a talking baby engineer weapons in his bedroom while his parents remain completely unaware, or from seeing Peter Griffin survive the kind of physical punishment that would reduce a building to rubble and then walk away complaining about his back. That kind of strange is the surface layer, the one that gets discussed in reviews and on podcasts, the one that ends with someone declaring the show to be either genius or garbage and both camps feeling equally satisfied with their verdict. This is about a different kind of strange. A quieter one, the kind that only becomes visible when you stop watching for the jokes and start watching for the patterns underneath them. Family Guy has been on television for more than 25 years. It was cancelled in 2002 and brought back from the dead in 2005 by DVD sales and Adult Swim reruns, which is already a remarkable story in its own right. It has produced more than 400 episodes across 23 seasons. It has been called lazy, brilliant, offensive, and groundbreaking at various points in its run, sometimes in the same paragraph by the same writer. Critics have spent decades trying to agree on what it actually is and what, if anything, it is genuinely trying to say beneath the layers of absurdism and shock comedy. But underneath all of it, underneath the Conway Twitty interruptions and the Cleveland falling out of his bathtub and the chaos that Peter Griffin manages to generate on a weekly basis without apparent effort, there is a mythology, not an accident of continuity, not a collection of writers on separate seasons happening to agree on the same background details by coincidence. An actual internal mythology assembled episode by episode across the show's entire run that rewards sustained attention in ways the average viewer would never suspect if they were only watching for what the surface layer is offering. A body of lore that has been built quietly in the background of courtroom scenes, tucked into throwaway lines about DNA tests and family histories and the names on birth certificates, planted in moments that land and then disappear before most viewers have time to think too carefully about what was just said. Details that sit in the official record of the show's canon, uncontested and unaddressed, waiting. Tonight we are going to move through that mythology carefully. There is no reason to rush through any of this. The best way to explore something this layered is the same way you would move through a long building at night, slowly, paying attention to what is on the walls, not racing for the exit. We are going to start at the very top of Quahog's power structure, with the family that owns that structure. And once you understand what the show has actually established about the Pewterschmidt dynasty across 23 seasons of carefully chosen details, you will find that almost everything else in Quahog looks different. Every crime that goes unpunished, every catastrophe that resolves without consequences, every inexplicable outcome that the show presents as cartoon logic will start to make a different kind of sense. So let us begin at the top, with Carter Roosevelt Pewterschmidt. Most people who watch Family Guy think of Carter Pewterschmidt as a cartoon-rich villain, the snobby, contemptuous father-in-law who has never liked Peter Griffin and makes no effort to conceal that fact. He appears at the Newport estate. He looks down at the situation his daughter has chosen for herself. He makes cutting remarks, and then the episode moves to the next thing. That reading of him is not wrong, but it is significantly incomplete in ways that become genuinely unsettling once you begin filling in what the show has actually provided across its run. Carter Roosevelt Pewterschmidt is not a cartoon-rich villain. He is a dynasty, and the difference between those two things matters enormously when you're trying to understand how Quahog, Rhode Island, actually works. Start with his name. His full name, as the show establishes it, is Carter Roosevelt Pewterschmidt. Roosevelt. That middle name sits there in his title, mentioned and then never explained or addressed again. In a show that makes choices about character names with at least some degree of intentionality, giving a character the middle name of one of the most powerful political families in American history is not something that happens without some awareness of what that choice signals. The Roosevelt family name carries a specific weight in the context of American power. It evokes a particular era in which certain families understood themselves as belonging at the center of national life, not by election or appointment, but by birthright, by the kind of ancestral proximity to power that eventually becomes indistinguishable from power itself. The show does not confirm a direct blood connection between Carter and any historical Roosevelt. It does not need to. The name is doing its work simply by being there. The family history runs deeper than a single surname suggests. According to what is established across multiple episodes, the Pewterschmidts were among the earliest English settlers in America. Landing in Newport, Rhode Island, is where the family's primary estate still stands. Newport is not a coincidental location for this kind of story. In the Gilded Age of the late 19th century, Newport was where American aristocracy went to build monuments to itself. The Vanderbilts constructed the Breakers there, completed in 1895, a 70-room Italian Renaissance palace whose entire architectural purpose was to signal that some American families occupied a categorically different tier of existence than everyone else who was alive at that time. The Pewterschmidt estate, as the show depicts it, mirrors that architectural language and that historical era. It is not simply a large house. It is the kind of structure that is built not primarily for the comfort of its inhabitants, but for its permanence, a physical declaration that this family arrived before the country fully formed and intends to remain long after the current generation has moved on. Then there is the business empire, which the show describes with a specificity that becomes more interesting the more carefully you sit with it. In the episode Grumpy Old Man, we receive the clearest portrait of what Pewterschmidt Industries actually represents. A $6 billion operation described as so thoroughly Carter-dependent that without his direct involvement, the entire structure would collapse. And the reach of that operation, as established across multiple episodes, is not a collection of luxury brands or a real estate portfolio or the visible kind of wealth that appears in society columns. It is infrastructure. Connections to US Steel, one of the most historically significant industrial corporations in American history. Shipping, pharmaceuticals, manufacturing, telecommunications, aerospace, biotech. Look at those sectors together, and you are not looking at a wealthy man's diversified investment strategy. You are looking at systems-level presence across the sectors that form the actual skeleton of how a country functions. Control over enough of those simultaneously, maintained and expanded across generations, is not wealth in the ordinary sense of the word. It is the kind of structural leverage that allows a private citizen to shape national outcomes without ever needing to hold a public office, make a public announcement, or attach his name to anything that could be examined. And to underline this, the show tells us directly, in passing, that Carter plays poker with people who run CNN. Not that he has acquaintances in media, not that he knows people who work in news, that he sits at a table with the individuals who run one of the country's major news networks as a social matter, as a regular feature of his private life. That detail is presented in exactly the casual tone that the most significant information in Family Guy tends to be presented in, and then the episode moves on. But sit with it for a moment. What does that level of social access mean for a private citizen? What does it mean for the infrastructure of information that shapes public understanding? What does it mean that the man whose house the Griffin family lives in can pick up a phone and have a conversation with the person who decides what CNN covers this week? The episode that reveals the most about how Carter's power actually operates in practice is the one that deals with what appears, on the surface, to be a local quahog political story. Carter wanted to eliminate the pollution regulations that were preventing Pewterschmidt Industries from dumping chemical waste without oversight. He did not go through official channels. He did not lobby. He did not contribute to campaign funds for officials who might vote in a favourable direction. He manufactured an entire fake grassroots political movement from scratch, a piece of political theatre that looked, from the outside, exactly like organic public anger rising up against an overreaching local government, but which was, in every meaningful sense, a production that Carter funded and directed. Mayor Adam West's government fell apart within 5 days of the campaign beginning. Basic municipal services collapsed. Garbage accumulated in the streets. The town entered a state that the show plays for comedy, but which the underlying logic presents as exactly what it is. A private citizen demonstrating, without ambiguity, that he can dissolve a local democracy whenever it inconveniences him. And when Peter eventually exposed the scheme, Carter faced no legal consequences. Not a fine, not an investigation, not even a public acknowledgement that anything improper had occurred. The system that would have investigated him had just been successfully dismantled by the same operation. Barbara Pewterschmidt's backstory adds a dimension to this that the show treats as a dark joke, but which the theory reads as foundational to understanding the family's relationship with the structures that surround them. In one canonical episode, it is revealed that Barbara's maiden name was Hebrewberg, that she is a Holocaust survivor, and that she concealed her Jewish identity when she married Carter because Carter's social world, those elite country clubs, where the real business of his life gets conducted, barred Jewish members. The show depicts both Barbara and Carter as having regarded this concealment as a reasonable and necessary decision. Read that carefully and let it settle. A woman who survived the Holocaust agreed to systematically erase her own identity so that her husband could maintain access to the social infrastructure that his power depends upon. And both characters present this as simply something that had to be done. What that tells us about the world Carter operates in is that even extreme forms of identity erasure are treated as pragmatic tools within his sphere, and that the access his world provides is considered worth any personal cost required to maintain it. Barbara did not build this machine, but she adapted herself completely to its requirements and became a functioning component of it. Now here is the detail that changes the entire shape of the Griffin family story once you see it clearly. In the episode, Peter Griffin, husband, father, brother, Carter lets something slip. One of his ancestors owned a man named Nate Griffin, who was Peter's direct ancestor. The Pewterschmidt family owned the Griffin bloodline. Legally, completely, for the duration of slavery in America. The dynastic relationship between the Pewterschmidts and the Griffins is not a contemporary class dynamic that developed from wealth disparity. It is a historical fact that the show plants in canon. For generations, a member of Carter's family held absolute legal authority over a member of Peter's family, and that relationship did not simply dissolve when the legal framework that made it possible was abolished. It transformed. It became economic coercion instead of legal ownership. It became Carter holding the mortgage to the house Peter believes he lives in. It became the offer of $1 million to simply disappear, made to Peter before the wedding, framed as generosity, but functioning as the kind of transaction that only makes sense if you regard the other person as something that can be purchased away from a situation rather than someone with a legitimate claim to their own choices. And the most concrete expression of that ongoing control is something the show confirms directly. Carter and Barbara Pewterschmidt pay for the Griffin family home. Peter does not own 31 Spooner Street. The Pewterschmidts do. Every month that Peter and Lois live in that house, they live in a structure that belongs to Carter. Their children were raised inside a building owned by the man whose family has, in one form or another, maintained authority over the Griffin family line across multiple generations. Whatever autonomy Peter believes he built for himself by living a working-class life, the foundation of that life, the literal house his family inhabits, is not his, it is Carter's. And Carter, who despises Peter openly and has never tried to hide it, chose not to remove his daughter from the financial infrastructure he controls, but to extend that infrastructure to include the Griffin household. Because that is what a dynasty does when it cannot prevent an unfavourable outcome. It contains rather than rejects. It keeps the situation within its sphere of influence rather than cutting it loose. Lois, for her part, did not escape the Pewterschmidt world by marrying Peter. The romantic reading of their union is that she found something genuine and working class and human in contrast to the cold calculations of the world she grew up in. That by choosing Peter, she removed herself from Carter's orbit and built something that belonged to her rather than to the family machine. But examine what actually happened and the romantic reading falls apart. She married Peter, and Carter invested in the marriage. He made sure his grandchildren would be raised in a house he owned, surrounded by resources that flowed through channels he controlled, within a sphere of influence that extended to every meaningful aspect of their daily existence. He hates Peter with a consistency that the show treats as comedy, but which, under this framework, reads as the genuine contempt of a man watching a structural arrangement he never wanted play out exactly the way he predicted, but he never withdrew. He extended his infrastructure to include the Griffins, because the grandchildren mattered, and the grandchildren would be easier to maintain within the dynasty if they were raised in a house that Carter paid for. And then there is the detail that is perhaps the most disturbing of all the threads in this section. In one episode dealing with Carter and a significant environmental storyline, it is revealed that Pewterschmidt Industries has developed a cure for cancer, not a more effective treatment, not an improved therapy that extends survival rates. A cure. Carter's pharmaceutical division has produced something that could fundamentally alter the human relationship with one of the most devastating diseases in history, and Carter has chosen not to release it because treating cancer over time generates more revenue than a one-time cure would. When Lois confronts him about this directly, he promises that he will release it for her sake. Then he does not. He looked at his daughter and lied to her, specifically about withholding medicine that could save the lives of millions of people, and he faced no consequences for that lie or for the underlying decision. And the same episode establishes that Carter's industrial operations have already given cancer to an entire town through chemical waste dumping. He created the disease in the population around him. He suppressed the cure, and none of the mechanisms that would ordinarily respond to those facts, the regulatory agencies, the journalists, the courts, reached him. Not because the system failed, because the system functioned precisely as systems do when a family has spent 2 centuries embedding itself into every institution that might otherwise hold it accountable. Peter Griffin commits crimes across this show's run that should result in multiple consecutive life sentences if you apply any ordinary standard of justice to them. He bombed a children's hospital. He received what functioned as a theatrical 7-day sentence. He has caused deaths, property destruction, environmental catastrophes, and institutional chaos on a scale that would make most people permanent residents of a federal facility. And yet he continues, unchanged yet unconvicted, walking the streets of Quahog as though consequence is simply not a mechanism that applies to his situation. The standard reading is that this is cartoon logic, sitcom convention, the genre requirement that the status quo resets between episodes. But the theory holds that it is not reset that explains his immunity. It is protection, operating at a level he is too oblivious to perceive. Someone above him is making problems disappear the way that old money has always made problems disappear, quietly, efficiently, and without leaving any record that could later be examined. That is the foundation of the Quahog mythology, a dynasty with founding-era roots, built on industrial infrastructure, political manipulation, compromat property, and a multi-generational relationship with the Griffin family that began with legal ownership and has never fully transitioned out of the structure that ownership created. Everything that happens in Quahog every consequence that evaporates, every investigation that goes nowhere, every person in the Griffin orbit who should face justice and does not, happens inside that structure. And now that we can see the structure, we can begin to examine the people living inside it more clearly, beginning with a girl in a courtroom who was wearing headphones at the precise moment that someone said the most important, true thing about her life that has ever been said aloud. In the third season of Family Guy, 13th episode, there is a courtroom scene. The episode is called Screwed the Pooch, and the central storyline involves Brian having impregnated Carter Pewterschmidt's prize-winning greyhound, which is the kind of premise that the show can establish in a single sentence and then build an entire episode around. Peter is trying to prove that Brian is a capable and caring father figure, and to demonstrate this, he begins listing facts about his own children that he cannot remember himself, but that Brian has always known. Chris's favourite ice cream flavour, Stewie's favourite bedtime story, and then delivered in the exact same casual tone as everything else on that list, without any change in weight or gravity, the information that Meg's real father is a man named Stan Thompson. Meg is in the courtroom at the time that sentence is spoken. She is sitting close enough that under normal circumstances she would hear every word, but she is wearing headphones and listening to music, and the sentence passes over her without landing. Nobody objects to what Brian just said. Nobody corrects it or challenges it or asks for clarification. The episode continues past this moment and then comes to its conclusion, and Family Guy does not return to the substance of that revelation directly for many seasons afterward. The line simply sits in the official record of the show's canon, uncontested and unaddressed, like a sealed document placed in a drawer and left there. It is not a cutaway gag. It is testimony, delivered by the most intellectually credible member of the Griffin household in a formal legal proceeding, and it says that Peter Griffin is not Meg's biological father. What we eventually learn about Stan Thompson, as the show returns to him across subsequent seasons and finally gives him a full introduction in its 22nd season, is limited but confirmed. He was someone Lois was involved with before Peter. He was aware that Meg existed as a result of their relationship. He did not want the fact of Meg's existence to complicate his life or his other relationships, so he left Meg with Lois, and Lois raised her with Peter as the adoptive father, while the entire Griffin family maintained the fiction that Peter's biological parentage was never in question. When Stan Thompson finally appears in person, he confirms that Meg was unplanned, that his departure was a choice made for his own convenience, rather than any consideration of what an infant needed, and that he spent decades not particularly thinking about the child he left behind. That is the established record, and it is worth sitting with before moving forward, because the theory does not stop at the straightforward affair story. What makes this thread compelling is not simply the confirmation of who Meg's biological father is, but the accumulation of contradictory, fracturing evidence around Meg's birth that the show has assembled across its run, and what that accumulation suggests about the relationship between the truth and the Griffin family's collective memory of it. Meg is born with her heart on top of her head in one episode, which is offered as the explanation for why she always wears a hat. In another episode, Peter changes her birth certificate to read Megatron Griffin, which the show frames as comedy, but which adds a layer of official instability to the most basic documentary record of her existence. In the first season episode, I Never Met the Dead Man, Peter expresses a kind of surprised disappointment that Meg is not a boy, as though he is encountering information about his own child that he has not fully integrated. In one cutaway gag, Peter and Lois are depicted fondly recalling Meg's first visit to a fire station, which turns out to be the occasion on which they attempted to abandon her as a newborn. In another context, Lois and Peter consider an abortion. These details are not, individually, conclusive evidence of anything beyond dark comedy, but accumulated together, they form a portrait of a birth story that cannot hold a consistent shape. that fragments across retellings in ways that a straightforward and settled biological parentage simply does not fragment. The theory suggests that this instability is not a failure of the writing room to maintain continuity across seasons. It is the symptom of a truth that the characters themselves cannot fully access. The Griffin family does not have a clear and internally consistent memory of Meg's arrival in their household, because the circumstances of that arrival were not simple, and whatever version of events was constructed for them to remember was either incomplete or deliberately inexact. Then there is the question of how Peter and Lois actually treat Meg throughout the show's run, and this is where the theory becomes uncomfortable in a way that is harder to dismiss as interpretation. Peter has described Meg as having been mistaken for a house cat for the first 4 years of her life. Lois regularly provides Meg with food scraps for school lunches, packaging the remains of other meals alongside taunting photographs. The family has, across various episodes, considered aborting her, attempting to abandon her, and at various points discussed selling her. Peter and Lois have expressed open regret at Meg's existence on multiple separate occasions, and the show consistently frames their treatment of Meg as operating outside the ordinary rules of bad sitcom parenting, as though their cruelty toward her specifically has a quality that is somehow categorically different from the chaos they direct at each other and at the rest of the world. The theory does not hold that Peter and Lois are consciously aware of Meg's different origins. It suggests something more elemental than conscious awareness. The research literature on blended family dynamics consistently documents measurable differences in how biological parents relate to stepchildren versus biological children, even when those parents are consciously bonded to the stepchild and genuinely believe they love both equally. This is not a moral failure or a character flaw. It is a biological reality that operates below the level of deliberate choice. And the pattern of Peter and Lois's treatment of Meg, accumulated across 23 seasons, looks less like the exaggerated, bad parenting they direct at each other, and more like the unconscious recognition that something about this particular child does not activate the full range of protective instincts that their biology would otherwise produce. Brian is the family member who most consistently, if inconsistently, defends Meg across the show's run, and Brian is also the one who revealed Stan Thompson's existence in that courtroom. The theory treats this not as coincidence, but as a signal. Brian is the most intellectually capable member of the Griffin household. If anyone in that family has, at some point, quietly examined the available evidence and arrived at some version of the truth about Meg's origins, it is Brian. He does not pursue it. He does not make it the subject of a storyline. He drops the information when the formal context of a legal proceeding demands honesty, and then returns to his usual pattern of protecting Meg from the worst of what the family directs at her, as though he knows that the full truth is something she is not presently equipped to receive, and that his role is not to uncover it but to hold a quiet space for her in a household that has never fully accepted her. The episode Don't Make Me Over from season 4 contains a moment that the theory treats as its most visible evidence. Meg receives a makeover at a mall. Hair, contacts, different posture. The episode presents this as a cosmetic transformation, driven by an esthetician with tools and products, and then depicts a result so extreme and total that the show itself seems uncertain about how to account for it. The kind of change that the episode depicts does not come from contact lenses and a blow dryer. Bone structure does not shift. Facial proportions do not realign because someone with a flat iron altered the way your hair falls. And yet Meg goes from being universally invisible and socially dismissed to being aggressively pursued by a record producer and receiving attention on live national television. The transformation is so complete that it reads less like a makeover and more like a state change, as though something that was being actively suppressed by Meg's default presentation briefly surfaced and revealed something quite different underneath. And at the end of the episode, Meg looks at the response she has generated and says that being beautiful is too much work, and reverts to her previous presentation. The theory reads this not as vanity reconsidered, but as suppression re-established. Whatever was briefly visible retreats, and Meg returns to invisibility, which is the state she was engineered for. Stan Thompson's name was spoken aloud in a courtroom in the 3rd season of Family Guy, heard by everyone except the person it concerned most. It sat in the record for years, circled by other episodes that couldn't agree on what Meg's birth looked like, what her early childhood contained, or what Peter's initial response to her existence was. The show eventually confirmed it. A man existed before Peter. He left a child. That child was given to the Griffins and raised under a fiction that the entire family knew was a fiction, except for the child herself. And in a household where a dog regularly defends her from her own parents' cruelty, the most honest account of who she is was offered in a courtroom she was present for, in a sentence she did not hear. That gap between the truth spoken and the truth received is something the Meg Griffin story has been structured around from its very beginning, and it is a gap that the theory suggests has never been fully closed, even now. Now we move to a different kind of question, entirely. Not about who someone is, but about what someone is. And the answer, if the theory holds, begins with a single digit: 1%. 1% of a genetic makeup that should not, under any ordinary biological logic, make a significant difference to anything. But in the Family Guy universe, 1% turns out to be exactly enough. Brian Griffin has died multiple times, not in dream sequences, not in alternate universe tangents that the show frames explicitly as departures from the main timeline. In the actual, official, primary continuity of Family Guy, Brian Griffin has stopped existing and then continued to appear in subsequent episodes. And the show has addressed this with varying degrees of acknowledgement and narrative commitment across its run. The most significant of these deaths, the one that the show committed to fully and then resolved in a way that generated more genuine audience reaction than almost any other narrative decision in the series' history, occurred in the 12th season. The episode is Life of Brian, and it aired on the 24th of November 2013. The setup is deceptively quiet. Stewie has recently destroyed his time machine at the junkyard, tired of the complications and close calls that come with having unrestricted access to temporal mechanics. He and Brian find a street hockey net in the junk while they are there and bring it home to use. They begin setting it up outside the house on Spooner Street. A car comes through without warning. Brian is struck at full speed and sustains injuries that the family's veterinarian describes as unsurvivable. The family gathers, they say their goodbyes. Brian thanks the Griffins for the life they gave him and tells them he loves them. Then he dies. This is not framed as a fantasy. It is not walked back by the episode's conclusion. The show commits to it completely. The Griffins hold a funeral. Peter delivers a eulogy that is, by the standards of what the show usually offers, Peter Griffin, genuinely affecting. A month passes in the narrative. A new dog named Vinny arrives, voiced by Tony Sirico, and begins the process of filling a space that the family is clearly not ready to have filled. Then 2 episodes later, in Christmas Guy, Stewie encounters a past version of himself who has travelled forward in time to purchase Christmas gifts early, using a return pad built into his time machine. Stewie takes that return pad, travels back to the moment just before Brian's death, and pushes Brian out of the path of the oncoming car. Brian lives. The timeline revises. Vinny ceases to have existed in the Griffin household's history. The show treats this as Stewie saving Brian, as the restoration of something that was wrongly taken. But the theory introduces a complication that does not resolve cleanly once you examine it. If Brian died in Life of Brian, if his brain ceased receiving oxygen, if his neurons fired their last signals, and his consciousness ended at the Quahog Veterinary Clinic in November 2013, then travelling back in time and preventing the accident does not resurrect that Brian. It does not reach backward through death and return consciousness to a body that had already gone cold. What it does is navigate to a parallel temporal node where a different version of Brian, one that was always going to exist in the sequence because it never experienced the car accident, continues forward. The Brian who thanked the Griffins, whose last conscious moments were an expression of love for the family that had taken him in off the street, is still dead in the original timeline. What Stewie brought back is not that Brian, it is the next Brian. A backup, to use a term that the theory applies literally rather than metaphorically. Here is where the canon becomes genuinely interesting. In an episode dealing with Brian's genetic makeup, he takes a DNA test as part of a broader storyline and discovers that he is 1% cat. The show delivers this as a comedic reveal and explores its implications for a few scenes before moving on. Brian starts exhibiting feline behaviours, scratching furniture, reacting to the vacuum cleaner differently. The episode extracts its comedy and then concludes, but the fact remains in the canon. Brian Griffin is genetically 1% cat. Now consider what the show has already established about cats in its universe. In the episode 420 from season 7, Quagmire adopts a stray cat named James as part of a broader storyline. And in a sequence played for extremely dark comedy, Peter accidentally kills the cat while trying to shave it as a prank, then continues cutting it multiple times because he believes the 9 Lives legend will simply reset it, establishing as direct and explicit show canon that in the Family Guy universe, cats literally have 9 biological lives. Not as folklore, not as metaphor, as a genuine biological mechanism. Cats in this universe die and then continue to exist because their species operates on a fixed life counter, and each death spends 1 entry from that counter until the counter reaches 0. If that is true of cats in this universe, and the show confirms that it is, then a character who is 1% cat carries some fractional version of that mechanism. Not the full count a purebred cat would have, perhaps, but enough feline genetics to qualify for the system in some modified form. Enough to mean that death for Brian is not the same permanent ending it would be for a character with no feline genetics at all. Enough to explain why every death Brian experiences in the show's canon results in continuation rather than a permanent ending. And enough to explain what is actually happening when Stewie's time machine is used to address Brian's death. It is not rewriting history. It is navigating to the next entry in Brian's biological life sequence, accessing the version of Brian that exists after the most recently spent life, and loading that version into the timeline where the previous one ended. The canonical deaths accumulate across the show's history in ways that support this framework. There is a future depicted in the direct-to-video film Stewie Griffin, the untold story in which Brian appears in a version of heaven alongside figures who died famously and young, sitting with Van Gogh and Cobain and Hemingway. That represents a canonical death depicted in a future the show explicitly establishes. In the episode Roads to Vegas, a timeline-specific version of Brian and Stewie end up in a desperate situation with a loan shark, and Brian jumps from a Vegas hotel balcony as part of a suicide pact. The show treats that timeline as fully real for the duration of the episode. In Back to the Pilot, a Brian from an alternate timeline arrives, bearing the marks of a violent death. Each of these is an entry in the counter spent in a specific timeline, reducing the total across the multiverse of Brian versions the show has established. Stewie Griffin knows. That is the part of this theory that carries the most weight when you let it settle. Stewie is a genius of a kind the show has never fully quantified. He built a functional time machine in his bedroom before he could walk with complete stability. He understands temporal mechanics and biological engineering and the full range of scientific disciplines that his various projects require. If Brian's 9-life mechanism is real, Stewie has done the calculation. He knows which number Brian is currently on. He has counted the deaths, cross-referenced them across the timelines he has visited and the futures he has glimpsed, and he has arrived at a number that frightens him. The fact that he destroyed the time machine in Life of Brian only to rebuild it in desperation during Christmas Guy suggests that the destruction was not impulsive, but intentional. He was trying to remove the tool that kept spending Brian's remaining lives on adventures and close calls that could have been avoided with better judgment. He tried to make Brian's current life permanent by refusing to navigate to the next one when this one ended through ordinary wear and age. Then Brian died in an accident that had nothing to do with their adventures, and Stewie made the calculation that one more life spent was worth it, and he broke the rule he had set for himself. He lives with that calculation now. Every road trip, every dangerous situation, every episode that puts Brian in the path of something that could kill him brings them closer to the point where there is nothing left in the sequence to navigate to. Stewie presses the button and there is no next Brian waiting. The counter has reached 0. The machine works perfectly and returns nothing. Brian does not fully understand any of this, or if fragments of it reach him, they do so as the vague existential dread that the show periodically gives him, the sense that something about his relationship to his own continuity is not entirely right, without the full clarity needed to act on that feeling. The 1% cat DNA is not a punchline the show deployed once for a comedic episode and then moved past. It is a countdown built into the character's genetic makeup, running quietly in the background of every season, getting closer to its terminal entry. And the person keeping careful track of where that countdown stands is the toddler who loves him most, doing the math that Brian cannot do for himself, hoping the arithmetic is wrong, but not believing that it is. Glenn Quagmire is one of the most watched, most referenced, and most quoted characters in Family Guy's history. He lives at 29 Spooner Street. He is a commercial airline pilot and a retired naval officer who served with distinction. He has the kind of face that the show renders as perpetually cheerful, in a way that reads, once you start paying attention, less like genuine contentment and more like a fixed expression that the face has learned to hold regardless of what is happening underneath it. And he has a catchphrase, a single word repeated with variations, that the theory does not read as comic punctuation, but as something considerably more specific and considerably more significant. The theory around Glenn Quagmire is not primarily about his behaviour, though his behaviour is the most visible evidence. It is about the architecture of his identity, the way the show has structured his character across its run to present two entirely distinct psychological profiles, sharing one face and one body, alternating control based on specific environmental triggers, with a dividing line between them that the show draws and redraws without ever naming what it is drawing. Start with what is directly observable, the thing you can watch in any random Quagmire episode without any theoretical framework applied to it. When Glenn Quagmire is discussing his military service, or his career as a pilot, or his relationship with his father, or the structural and tactical dimensions of aviation, his manner changes. Not dramatically, not in a way that calls attention to itself, but his cadence slows to something more measured. His posture carries a different quality. His voice loses the manic, accelerating energy that the show normally gives him and becomes something more deliberate, more professionally calibrated. He is articulate in these moments. He is present in a way that the rest of his characterization does not always make available to him. Then a sexual stimulus enters the environment. Someone makes a comment, a phrase lands with a suggestive quality, a situation shifts in a specific direction. And the change is immediate. The voice accelerates. The head movement changes. The body language becomes something categorically different, invasive rather than contained, expanding into rather than respecting the space around him. A word repeats in the particular way that his catchphrase repeats, and the person who was speaking calmly about aircraft weight distribution a moment ago is no longer present. Two behavioural profiles, two distinct sets of motor patterns, two completely different ways of occupying a body, and engaging with the world. One triggered by the professional context that Glenn values most, the other triggered by sexual stimuli in the environment. Alternating, consistent, never integrated, the show establishes the source of this fracture directly in canon. And this is one of the places where the theory does not require significant interpretive work, because the show has already done the heavy lifting. In a canonical moment that the series presents without softening it, Quagmire reveals that he was abused as a young man. The perpetrator was an adult woman, a plumber working at the Quagmire home. The show does not play this as comedy in the moment it is revealed. It is presented as the origin of Quagmire's hypersexuality, a canonical backstory that the writers chose to plant in the character's history as an explanatory frame for his adult behaviour. The psychiatric literature on dissociative identity disorder, which is the diagnostic framework the theory applies to Quagmire's presentation, consistently identifies severe young trauma as one of the primary developmental pathways through which a person's sense of identity fractures into distinct, alternating states. When a child experiences abuse of this kind at a developmental stage, and particularly when the environment around them provides no adequate response to that abuse, no protection, no acknowledgement, no framework for processing what happened, the child's psyche sometimes responds by compartmentalizing the experience into a separate identity state that can contain the damage while the rest of the self attempts to continue functioning. The compartmentalized state absorbs the trauma. The primary self continues developing as though that trauma happened to someone else. Glenn Quagmire grew up in a household where his father was primarily absent, deployed overseas as a naval pilot during much of Glenn's childhood. His mother, as additional canonical episodes establish, had her own significant problems with boundaries around sexuality that created additional layers of damage in Glenn's development. He was abused as a young man. His father was not there to protect him. His mother's own behaviour added complications rather than providing a framework for recovery. And his psyche responded by fracturing along the line that the trauma created, producing Glenn, the part that wanted to be a pilot like his father, that valued duty and service and competence, and producing the giggity personality, the part that absorbed the sexual trauma and became frozen as a young man, endlessly reenacting the circumstances of that original violation through adult compulsive hypersexuality. That is why the giggity personality is not Glenn exercising poor judgment or indulging a character flaw. It is a trauma response that predates adult choice. It is a 6-year-old's attempt to process something that a 6-year-old brain cannot process, repeated indefinitely across decades because the underlying injury was never treated and the compartment that holds it has never been integrated back into the primary identity. The military and aviation career is where the split between these two states is most structurally visible. Glenn Quagmire is canonically identified as a US Navy ensign who served with genuine distinction. His father, Dan Quagmire, was a decorated pilot, a man who flew supply missions into hostile territory and emerged with the kind of record that creates a powerful model for a son to organise himself around. Glenn followed that path. He joined the Navy. He flew. He built a career around an activity that requires precision, training, and the kind of sustained competent attention that the giggity personality does not possess and has never possessed, because it is, at its psychological core, a 6-year-old. The cockpit is the one environment in which the giggity personality goes dormant. Not because Glenn consciously manages the switching there, but because the cockpit is, at 30,000 feet, categorically free of the sexual stimuli that trigger the alternative state. Glenn is safe there in a way he is not safe anywhere on the ground. Flight was not just a career choice. It was and continues to be the one available escape from the personality that hijacked his ground-level existence decades ago and has been running it ever since. Watch how he responds when people are careless around aircraft. In episodes where Glenn is actually piloting rather than simply wearing a uniform as a visual detail, He demonstrates a quality of focus and a depth of investment that are entirely absent from his social behaviour. He gets genuinely angry when Peter treats the cockpit as a playground, not the performed anger of someone irritated by an inconvenience, but the real anger of someone who is watching something sacred being disrespected. That anger belongs to Glenn. The giggity personality does not have that kind of investment in anything. The giggity personality exists only to pursue compulsive gratification through whatever means are available. Glenn protects aviation because aviation is the one thing the giggity alter has never been able to contaminate. And Glenn knows, at some level below articulation, that if it ever gets contaminated, there will be nowhere left to go. The episode screams of silence. The story of Brenda Q is the most complete piece of evidence for this reading in the show's canon. Brenda is Glenn's sister. Her boyfriend Jeff is abusive. The situation has been escalating, and in that episode, the person who devises and executes a plan to protect Brenda by permanently removing Jeff from the situation is not the personality that most of Quahog knows. It is Glenn, fully present, focused, tactical, drawing on a trained military professional's capacity for calm under pressure in a situation that requires exactly that capacity. The manic energy is gone. The compulsive behaviour is absent. The motor patterns are different. For the duration of that episode, in response to a threat to someone he genuinely loves, Glenn fronts completely and the giggity personality steps back entirely, because the situation requires a competent soldier and the giggity personality is not a soldier. It is a frozen 6-year-old, and a frozen 6-year-old cannot execute a protection plan. Then the situation resolved, Brenda was safe and the altar returned, because it always returns. The disorder is too old, the trauma too embedded, the fracture too deep and too long-standing for anything short of sustained professional treatment to address. And Glenn has never received that treatment. His catchphrase is worth considering as the final element of this section, because it is the piece that the theory treats as most structurally revealing once it is read through this framework. Giggity is not a celebration of enjoyment. It is a verbal marker, a repeated vocalization that announces a specific state transition. Every time it surfaces, it is doing the same thing, signaling that Glenn is no longer the one in control of the body they share. It is the personality shift made audible. And in a show that has given this character this exact vocal tick across 23 seasons, in exactly these circumstances, the repetition of that single word has been quietly functioning as a clinical notation the entire time. Not a punchline, a marker, a repetitive vocalization indicating a dissociative state activation in a character who has never, across the entire run of the series, been given the framework to understand what is happening to him or why. Glenn is 30,000 feet up, flying away from it, and every time he lands, it is waiting. Now we move to the question of containment, not the psychological containment of an individual identity, but something broader and stranger, the question of whether an entire neighbourhood in Quahog, Rhode Island, has been functioning as a managed zone for anomalies that would be too disruptive to allow to exist in uncontrolled space. And the figure at the centre of that question is a man who flew into Quahog Town Hall wearing a Batman costume and declared himself mayor, and whose decades-long tenure in that position has always been presented as the show's most reliable source of pure absurdism. The theory around Mayor Adam West asks a simple question. What if he is not absurd at all? What if every statement he makes that appears to be the product of an unmoored mind is actually an accurate description of something that the other people around him lack the perceptual framework to verify? Adam West has been the mayor of Quahog since season 2 of the series. His driver's license, as shown in one episode, lists him as 61 years old. But across the show's full run, he references events from the 1960s with a freshness that suggests recent experience rather than 4-decade-old memory. Every other major character in the show demonstrates at least some evidence of temporal movement, however inconsistent. Children who were young in early seasons are slightly older in later ones. Relationships have evolved. The world has shifted around the characters in ways that accumulate across the series. West does not shift. He exists in a kind of temporal anchor state, fixed at a single reference point, while the rest of Quahog moves around him in ways he appears to perceive but not participate in. The theory does not frame this as the show simply forgetting to age a character. It frames it as the evidence of what West actually is, a consciousness that exists on a different temporal axis than the people around him, one that does not synchronize with the linear progression of time, the way that ordinary human consciousness does. And the further theory, built on top of that observation, holds that whoever or whatever is responsible for Quahog's deeper reality is aware of this property of West's existence and has given him the mayoral position specifically to contain it. Consider his famous statements, the ones that the show presents as evidence of a deranged mind, and examine them against the reality of what is actually being described. West once conducted an investigation into who was stealing his water. He spent a significant portion of Quahog's municipal budget on this investigation and approached it with complete seriousness. The episode presents this as evidence of mayoral incompetence, but here is what West's investigation is actually about. He has perceived that water in his environment disappears, specifically that water flows into drains and into the earth, and then is simply gone, not cycled back into the water table in any way he can observe or account for. If you are a consciousness that can perceive the actual mechanisms of the animated world you inhabit, this is what drains look like. Water flows in the animation and then ceases to exist in any subsequent frame, because the animators draw water flowing and then it is simply not part of the scene anymore. West is accurately describing what he sees. The water is being taken by the people who decide what is in each frame. And his solution, to negotiate with another actor he recognizes as existing on the same meta level, is the only approach that makes sense from inside that perceptual framework. In one scene, following an incident involving a civic waste of funds, West is struck by something and reaches a conclusion. His god, he says, he is a tomato. The show plays this as pure randomness. But in that scene, his character model has been drawn with a particularly round, reddish, simplified shape. From the perspective of a character who can see how he is actually rendered in the animation, the statement is accurate. He has looked at himself through the eyes of someone who perceives the drawn lines rather than the intended meaning of those lines, and he has correctly identified what he currently looks like as a piece of animation. When pieces went missing from a light bright that spelled his name, West experienced what the show depicts as an identity crisis. "Who am I?" he asked. "What number did you call?" These are not the responses of a man confused by a toy. These are the responses of a consciousness that understands its own identity as constructed and maintained by external naming, and which the episode's spies reminiscent of us confirm something about West's history that the theory treats as the show revealing its hand. In that episode, it is established that Adam West is a KGB sleeper agent, a trained intelligence asset programmed with a trigger phrase that can activate a specific behavioural state. This detail is delivered with the same comedic framing that the show applies to all of West's most significant moments, the framing that has kept these revelations from registering as anything other than jokes for most of the series' audience. But consider what this actually establishes. Adam West has been monitored, programmed, and deployed by government intelligence agencies. His activation phrase is Cold War era, suggesting the relationship between West and those agencies dates to the 1960s. The show confirms that he has been an asset for at least 60 years, embedded in a specific location, performing a specific function, aware on some level that his existence is not the ordinary civilian life it presents as. The theory connects this to something broader. Whoever placed West in Quahog and gave him the mayoral position did so knowing what he was, knowing what he could perceive, and understanding that the best way to manage a consciousness that can see through the constructed reality of a cartoon universe is to give that consciousness a role that explains all of its anomalous observations as symptoms of incompetence rather than evidence of an accurate perception. As long as West appears to be simply insane, the things he correctly observes cannot be acted upon. The management is not containment in the sense of a locked facility. It is containment through reputation. Make the person who sees the truth, the person no one believes, and the truth. He appeared as a force ghost before his canonical death in the episode that acknowledged the real-world death of the actor who voiced him. Because his relationship with the before and after of existence is not linear in the way everyone else's is. When West died, the show could not simply end his presence. His ghost remained functional. His governance of Quahog continued in spectral form. The other characters treated this as a problem to be managed rather than a permanent resolution, because they understood at some level that a permanent resolution was not available for what West represented. The government put him in Quahog knowing that whatever he is would be less dangerous inside a cartoon universe that already operates on flexible rules than it would be outside of one. He ended up becoming the mayor. He spent decades announcing truths that everyone dismissed as absurdity. And somewhere in his tenure, the awareness that he was being watched gave way to the awareness that he was the one doing the watching, and that the real audience for everything that happens in Quahog was not the citizens of the town, but the higher dimensional beings who had been observing the whole thing from the beginning. West knew that. He was always going to know that. That is, ultimately, why they had to keep him contained. Most people who have watched Family Guy for any length of time carry a single image of death in their head. A robed figure with a scythe who lives with his mother, who sprains his ankle chasing Peter Griffin, who complains about his social life with the weary resignation of someone who has been stuck in an unsatisfying job for longer than he can accurately calculate. It is one of the show's more memorable recurring presences, and it tends to be thought of as a single consistent character, the Grim Reaper rendered as an incompetent middle-aged bachelor who has never quite figured out how to make his life work. But the theory does not see a single consistent character when it looks at the death of Family Guy. It sees two different entities who held the same franchise position at different times, a management hierarchy above them that they answer to, a departmental division between the death that handles humans and the one that handles animals, and a corporate structure for managing mortality across different animated universes that has been visible in plain sight in the show's canon for 2 decades without anyone fully assembling the pieces. Start with the most basic and most documented fact. Death appears in the 2nd season episode, Death is a Bitch, voiced by Norm Macdonald. This is the character's introduction, and Macdonald's specific vocal quality, dry, flat, slightly bemused, gives Death a particular presence in that episode. Then Norm Macdonald did not return. Not because the character was retired or recast as a narrative choice, but because Macdonald was committed to another television project called A Minute with Stan Hooper and was unavailable. Adam Carolla stepped into the role for all subsequent appearances and has voiced Death in every episode since. The official explanation is scheduling. The theory does not dispute the scheduling explanation. It accepts it entirely, and then asks what it means in the context of the show's own fictional universe. Because from inside the logic of the Family Guy world, what actually happened is this. Death appeared with one voice, one set of behavioural mannerisms, one particular personality texture, and then Death appeared again and was different. Not subtly different, fundamentally different in the most basic and immediate way a person can be different from another person. In the voice, in the affect, in the fundamental quality of presence. The theory holds that these are not the same entity. They are 2 different deaths, two different individuals who occupied the same franchise position in sequence, and the scheduling conflict is simply the real-world mechanism by which the show happened to reveal a truth about its own fictional universe that it had not planned to make visible. This is reinforced by something even more concrete: the skull. In his first appearance, when the hood is removed from Death's robe, the skull beneath is clean, bare bone, simply rendered. Then in a later episode, when the hood comes down again, the skull is not bare bone. It is full of insects and snakes, crawling in and out of the eye sockets and the mouth and the ear canals. Different designs for the same character are often explained away as continuity errors, and that is a reasonable explanation when the difference is small. But two skulls that look nothing like each other, one clean and one teeming with life, is not a continuity error. That is the show depicting two different beings wearing the same robe and carrying the same scythe, operating in the same role across time, without making any particular announcement about what that means. The departmental structure appears in the episode Mr. Saturday Night in a detail that is easy to overlook because it arrives in the middle of a comedic sequence about a dinner party gone wrong. When someone at the party nearly chokes on a dinner roll but survives, Death arrives to collect a different guest who has actually died. And then, separately, Death's dog appears and asks whether someone choked on the dinner roll. Brian confirms that the person recovered. The dog apologizes politely and leaves. The show presents this as a comedic grace note, Death having a dog who also shows up when animals are potentially dying. But that is not what this scene actually depicts, if you examine it carefully. Death's dog did not come because Death brought his dog along on a house call. Death's dog arrived independently, with its own question to ask, its own jurisdiction to check, its own separate operational domain. Death handles humans. Death's dog handles animals. They are not the same entity with a pet. They are co-workers, two members of the same organizational structure, managing different client populations in the same geographic territory. The show establishes this division without naming it, presents it in a single brief exchange, and then moves on. But the division is real within the show's logic, and it means that the Grim Reaper of Family Guy is not a singular cosmic presence. It is a role within a larger framework. The most structurally revealing moment in the entire Death mythology happens in the episode Grumpy Old Man, when Carter Pewterschmidt falls asleep while driving, crashes his car, and Death is killed in the accident. What happens next is what the theory treats as the clearest evidence for the corporate model it proposes. After Death dies, a much larger, more powerful version of Death arrives. Super Death, the show calls him. Using the most direct naming convention available, Super Death informs regular Death that Death is being reincarnated as a child in China. Regular Death accepts this, disappears, and then reappears almost immediately, revealing that he has been reborn and has returned to his position. The episode continues. Consider what this sequence of events actually establishes. Death can die. Death is subject to mortality in the same basic way that Death's clients are. When Death dies, there is someone above Death in the organizational hierarchy who shows up to manage the transition, who has authority over Death's continued employment, and who processes the death of a Death the way a supervisor processes the departure of a regional manager. The reincarnation is not magical or spiritual in the way that word usually implies in this kind of context. It is operational. Death cycles out of the position, gets reborn, and eventually returns to work. Super Death is not a more powerful cosmic force. He is middle management for the Mortality franchise, the person responsible for ensuring that the service continues without interruption when one of the regional contractors goes offline. This is why Death is so thoroughly bad at his job. He is not the eternal embodiment of mortality, the end of all things made manifest in robed form. He is a person who took a franchise position managing mortality for one specific animated universe, and is doing his imperfect best to fulfill the terms of his employment contract. He lives with his mother because he has not had time to build a separate life while managing the logistics of being the sole human death contractor for an entire cartoon reality. He sprains his ankle chasing Peter Griffin because he is a physical being who can be physically injured, not a cosmic force impervious to the mechanics of the world he operates in. He has inconsistent powers because those powers are not natural abilities, but contractually granted tools with specific terms of use. Kill by touch except when the narrative requires the person to survive. Time travel, but only when the plot demands it. Manage human deaths, but not animal deaths, because that division belongs to a different department. His relationship with time is particularly telling in this regard. Death can grant time travel in the episodes that require it, and has done so in ways that allow characters to revisit and alter their personal histories. This is not an ability you would expect an eternal cosmic force to have, but it is exactly the kind of ability you would expect a franchise manager of a sitcom universe to have, because a sitcom universe requires temporal flexibility to tell its stories, and the person responsible for maintaining continuity in that universe would need the tools to manage moments when the narrative requires someone to understand their life differently. Death is not just managing who dies and when, he is managing the story. He is a narrative maintenance contractor as much as a mortality contractor, and the time travel ability is part of the service package. In the episode 3 Acts of God, Death tells Cleveland that the Cleveland show is cancelled and transports Peter and Cleveland to heaven for a meeting with God. This detail matters to the theory because it means Death is not bound to the Family Guy universe specifically. He has access to information about other animated universes. He can travel between them. He exists within a network of deaths and mortality franchises that extends across multiple shows, multiple fictional realities, multiple animated universes that each have their own mortality contractor, operating according to their own narrative requirements. Family Guy's Death is one node in a larger system, one regional manager in a corporation that spans the animated multiverse. The most honest summary of what this theory reveals about Family Guy's death is this: he is a tired, imperfect person doing a franchise job in one animated universe, accountable to a management hierarchy he did not choose, operating with tools that have inconsistent terms of use, cycling through positions that recur across his reincarnations, never quite achieving the cosmic authority his title implies, and perpetually managing clients who make his job more difficult than it needs to be. Peter Griffin is probably at the top of that list. Now we turn to a theory that does not begin with a character or a relationship, but with a physical symptom. Something visible in every episode if you know how to see it. Something that has been there since the first season, accumulating evidence through every major arc the show has run, and which points toward a conclusion that the show has been quietly building toward without ever stating directly. The Griffins are not biologically normal, not by the show's internal standards, not even by the flexible biological logic that the Family Guy universe applies to its characters. They are outliers, aberrations, a family whose physical presentation, cognitive profile, and capacity to survive trauma that would permanently destroy anyone else accumulates into a pattern that does not resolve into coincidence when you examine it closely enough. Begin with the visible evidence because it is the most immediate. Peter Griffin is a large man whose face is structured in a way that the show renders as distinctive even by animated standards. His chin cleft is not a normal anatomical feature, exaggerated for visual clarity. It is an architectural abnormality, a structural variation in bone and tissue development that dominates his entire facial profile and has no equivalent in any other character in the show's universe. His neck and head exist as a single continuous mass without clear delineation, which is not simply a comedic rendering choice, but a physical characteristic that the show treats within its reality as actually how Peter looks to the people around him. Chris Griffin was reported in a newspaper article as an elephant child at birth, described as arriving at an unusual size by standards that surprised the medical staff present. He has inherited Peter's facial structure with an exactness that does not follow ordinary genetic logic. Children receive genetic material from both parents, and the interaction produces variation. But Chris is a copy of Peter rendered at a younger age with essentially no visible maternal contribution, as though the DNA that produced Chris had only one source rather than two. That is not how genetics works. That is what genetics looks like when something has gone wrong at the replication level. Meg's eyes are, within the show's reality, abnormally large. This is remarked upon, both by other characters and through the visual disparity between Meg's ocular proportions and those of the people around her. That disparity is not a stylistic choice that applies uniformly to the show's art direction. It is specific to Meg. Her eyes are different from other characters' eyes in a way that the show's own internal visual logic treats as a genuine physical anomaly rather than an aesthetic convention. Now consider where these people live and have lived their entire lives. The town of Quahog, Rhode Island, contains a heavily industrialized harbour that the show confirms, across multiple episodes, has been used as an illegal chemical waste dump by corporate interests for decades. In one canonical episode, the Griffin family goes swimming in Lake Quahog at a cabin and discovers that the Quahog oil refinery has been pumping toxic waste directly into the lake for years. The physical consequences of contact with that water are immediate and dramatic. The family's hair falls out on the spot. The show then confirms that Mayor Adam West had personally approved this dumping arrangement in exchange for hair products, and that when Lois later became mayor and worked to stop the contamination, the refinery's CEO simply bribed her to resume it. The waste flows back. The contamination continues. This is not background detail. This is established fact within the show's canon, confirmed repeatedly across different episodes and different characters. The episode that provides the most direct evidence for what long-term exposure to that contamination does to the Griffins specifically is a segment in the third season viewer mail episode. A truck carrying nuclear waste crashes directly in front of the Griffin home. The entire family is thoroughly exposed, and what happens to each of them is not illness or injury. What happens is mutation. Peter develops the ability to alter his physical form. Lois develops superhuman strength. Stewie's cranium dramatically enlarges. Brian moves at speeds far beyond what a dog's physiology should allow. Chris develops the ability to generate and project fire. Even Meg's nails behave in ways that no standard biology accounts for. The show treats this as a fantastical one-off episode, a what-if segment with no lasting implications for the main continuity. But what it demonstrates is a biological fact about the Griffin family that has implications beyond the segment's comedic framing. When Mayor Adam West, in that same broader episode context, rolls himself in radioactive waste in an attempt to replicate whatever the Griffins experienced, he develops lymphoma, standard human cancer, the ordinary biological response to toxic chemical exposure in a human body without whatever the Griffins' genetics carry. The contrast is exact and deliberate. The Griffins exposed to concentrated toxic waste and mutate. Adam West exposes to toxic waste and gets cancer. The difference is in the DNA, and the difference in the DNA is traceable to the environment these people have been living in their entire lives, and their parents lived in before them, and the generations before that in a town built on industrial contamination that has been leaching into the water supply since before anyone now living in Quahog was born. Peter Griffin's IQ was formally assessed in the episode Petarded. The results placed him in a range that the show's own on-screen graphic places below the threshold for standard intellectual disability classification. This is not the show exaggerating a character's stupidity for comedy and then walking it back. The episode treats the result as a confirmed medical fact. Peter Griffin is, according to a formal assessment conducted by a Rhode Island state mental health professional and depicted as canonical within the show's reality, intellectually disabled. His intelligence genuinely does not function within standard human parameters. Chris Griffin's cognitive development follows a similar trajectory. As he ages across the series, the show depicts a pattern of intellectual impairment that mirrors his father's in ways that exceed ordinary genetic transmission of low intelligence. Both Peter and Chris display the same cognitive profile, the same physical abnormalities, the same pattern of facial structure, inherited with unusual exactness. The impairment tracks along the male line, while Meg and Stewie, though different from each other in dramatic ways, do not present the same cognitive profile. The theory reads this as the expression of a mutation that travels through the Y chromosome, a genetic corruption introduced by decades of environmental toxic exposure and now expressing itself in each male generation with increasing consistency. Stewie Griffin occupies the opposite extreme. His intelligence has been estimated in the show's canon at somewhere between 250 and 300 IQ points, a number so far beyond the standard human range that it cannot be accurately measured by existing instruments. The theory does not treat this as simply the show giving a character a superpower for comedic purposes. It treats it as the same toxic exposure process that produced Peter's cognitive impairment, expressing itself differently in a different genetic context. The contamination does not produce a single uniform outcome. It disrupts the genetic expression of intelligence in whichever direction the underlying DNA is most susceptible to being pushed. In Peter's case, and Chris's case, it pushed down. In Stewie's case, it pushed up so far that the result is categorically different from ordinary human intelligence. Both extremes, the profound impairment and the genius, exist in the same household. Both are the products of the same environmental forcing. And then there is the question of survival. Peter Griffin has sustained injuries across the show's run that would kill an ordinary person many times over. He has been shot. He has been crushed. He has been caught in explosions. He has fallen from heights that should produce unsurvivable trauma. He has been submerged, burned, struck by vehicles, and subjected to every category of physical catastrophe that the show has had occasion to deploy. He always recovers, not with medical assistance, not after extended hospitalization, but completely, returning to baseline function within the timeline of a single episode or less. The Griffin family's healing capacity is not a sitcom reset. It is a biological feature of people whose genetics have been modified by chemical exposure in ways that include, among other things, an enhanced capacity to survive trauma. Dr. Hartman, the family's physician, is the figure whose role within all of this the theory treats as the most deliberately obscured. He is canonically described as the worst-rated doctor at Quahog Hospital. He has been confirmed in various episodes as having never graduated high school, as having a dyslexia diagnosis, as being an active alcoholic, as consistently misreading his patients' conditions and offering incorrect diagnoses. He loses his medical license temporarily. He performs procedures incorrectly. He tells the Griffins with consistent regularity that they are medically fine when the evidence in front of him indicates that they are clearly not fine at all. The theory does not read this as incompetence. It reads it as the performance of incompetence as a cover. Dr. Hartman's actual function within this framework is not to treat the Griffin family. It is to observe them, to document the ongoing expression of their mutations, to provide regular access to their medical data while ensuring that no genuine treatment occurs that might interfere with the natural progression of whatever the toxic environment has introduced into their genetics. He tells them they are fine because treating them would alter the data. The data is what he is there to collect. He has in canon mentioned creating a giant hostile chicken through cloning experiments he was conducting outside of his hospital practice. This line arrives and departs quickly, presented as a throwaway gag that explains the origin of a recurring character. But what it establishes, if you stop and look at it, is that Dr. Hartman has access to genetic manipulation technology, runs experiments with it outside of any institutional oversight, and has achieved results that require both sophisticated equipment and substantial funding. A small-town general practitioner does not have those resources unless someone with those resources provided them. The Griffins are not his patients, they are his subjects, and somewhere in the infrastructure that the Pewterschmidt dynasty has built across Quahog's pharmaceutical and biotech sectors, there is a connection that the show has never needed to draw explicitly because the shape of it is already visible in the outline. Houses in Quahog do not work the way houses are supposed to work. This is not a general observation about the cartoon logic of animated spaces. This is a specific and documented pattern that the show has established through a sequence of canonical details that, taken individually, seem like continuity errors or background gags, and taken together resolve into something considerably more deliberate and considerably more interesting. The most direct piece of evidence appears in the second season, episode E, Peterbus Unum, which is a real episode from that season and deals with Peter applying for a permit to install a swimming pool at his home. When the city reviews his application, they discover something that the show presents as a bureaucratic absurdity. 31 Spooner Street does not appear on any official map of Quahog, not on outdated maps, not on maps with incomplete coverage of the residential areas. On every municipal map in the city's official record, 31 Spooner Street simply does not exist as a cartographic entry. The house is physically present. Mail is delivered there. The Griffins pay utility bills and property taxes. The address is operationally real in every way that matters for daily function. But in the official geographic record of the city, the location of the house is absent. Peter's response to this discovery is to declare his home the independent nation of Pretoria, based on the legal reasoning that if his property has no official existence within US municipal records, it also has no legal obligation to the US government. The show treats this as comedy, and Peter's territorial declaration generates the expected absurdist escalation. The US government quickly recognizes Pretoria as a sovereign state, then militarizes the border around the property, cuts utilities and basic services, imposes sanctions, and fires actual missiles at the house before Peter finally agrees to re-annex Pretoria into the United States. The theory does not read the government's response as disproportionate bureaucratic silliness. It reads it as panic. If 31 Spooner Street was removed from official maps deliberately, as the theory proposes, then the removal was done by someone who understood what the house actually is and who wanted to keep it outside the official geographic record of the city. When Peter accidentally discovered that status and then leveraged it to claim sovereignty, he inadvertently challenged the containment infrastructure that had been put in place to manage what exists at that address. The government's aggressive response, the missiles, the sanctions, the militarized border, was not about the indignity of a private citizen declaring independence. It was about the terror of someone who exists at a managed anomaly location, suddenly operating outside the management framework. The house itself demonstrates properties that do not belong to ordinary residential architecture. In the third season Christmas special, the interior of the Griffin home is destroyed by fire. The walls are burned, the furniture is gone. The family's possessions are reduced to ash and structural ruin. By the following episode, the house is in perfect condition. Not repaired, not rebuilt, not replaced with equivalent items. Reset. The same green couch, the same wall decorations, the same carpet, and the same kitchen, and the same layout down to the details that would require individual replacements if the house had been physically restored. The show offers no explanation for this. The wiki notes that it is unclear how the house was repaired. The theory notes that it was not repaired, it was returned to its default configuration the way a system returns to factory settings when the current state has been sufficiently disrupted. This reset behaviour extends to smaller inconsistencies across the show's run. Rooms that appear in one episode and do not exist in subsequent ones, a downstairs bathroom that materialises when a specific scene requires it and is never part of the house's architecture otherwise, a fireplace in the living room that exists for the Christmas special and nowhere else. These are not animation errors, they are the house generating temporary spaces as the narrative requires them, drawing on an underlying template that contains more configurations than the standard floor plan expresses, and collapsing those temporary spaces back into the template when they are no longer needed. The residents of Spooner Street as a group constitute a pattern that the theory treats as equally significant to the pattern of the house itself. Every single resident of that street is, in some fundamental way, impossible. Peter, with his medically confirmed intellectual disability and his survival rate that defies standard human biology. Joe Swanson, at number 33, paralysed from the waist down by a canonical injury that the show has also given multiple contradictory explanations for, who regains and loses the use of his legs through entirely different mechanisms across different episodes with a fluidity that suggests his paralysis does not operate on the fixed biological principles that paralysis ordinarily operates on. Glenn Quagmire, whose human stamina and longevity exceed what standard biology allows for, and who never visibly ages across 2.5 decades of episodes. Cleveland Brown, who was canonically resident on Spooner Street, left for a separate series set in a different city, and then returned to the same house on the same street as though the intervening years had left no trace that required acknowledgement. Herbert, the elderly man, at number 35, who is old enough and has survived long enough that the show's own timeline renders him impossible without some mechanism that suspends the ordinary deterioration of a human body. These are not neighbours who happen to be unusual. When you map them against each other geographically, they are an anomaly cluster, a concentration of impossible or near impossible people in a single residential block that is statistically inconceivable as a random outcome. The theory holds that this concentration is not random, it is managed. The houses on Spooner Street are containment structures, residential scale facilities designed to provide an environment that looks like ordinary suburban life while actually providing the calibrated conditions under which impossible people can continue to exist without destabilizing the world beyond the block. The episode that confirms government awareness and monitoring of Spooner Street is, again, Spies Reminiscent of Us, which reveals that the house next door to the Griffins had been rented to undercover government agents running a surveillance operation on the neighbourhood. This is presented as a storyline specific to that episode's spy narrative. The theory reads it as the show accidentally or deliberately showing its structural infrastructure. Of course, there are government agents watching Spooner Street. There have always been government agents watching Spooner Street. The story in that episode is not that surveillance has been established on the block. The story is that the Griffins happen to have stumbled onto the existence of the surveillance that has always been there. The houses reset after catastrophic damage. The anomalous residents persist through experiences that should end them. The address does not officially exist. The government monitors the block. And Peter Griffin, who lives at the centre of all of this, is too oblivious to the evidence around him to have noticed any of it, which is, in its way, the most effective containment feature of all. The most dangerous subject in a managed environment is the one who becomes aware of the management. The fact that Peter has never understood what he is living inside, has never asked why his house restores itself after being destroyed or why his address is not on any map, is the property that makes the containment viable. Keep the subject unaware, keep the structure invisible, and the impossible people in their impossible houses will continue believing they're simply living in a slightly unusual neighbourhood in Rhode Island. Now we move to the oldest mystery in the Quahog mythology. Not the most dramatic, not the most structurally elaborate, but the one that has the most direct evidence attached to it. The evidence that exists in the character herself, in her body and her timeline, and the slow transformation visible across 2 decades of episodes. Lois Pewterschmidt Griffin does not age. This is not a metaphor, and it is not cartoon immortality. It is a specific and documentable impossibility that the show has been maintaining across its entire run with a consistency that exceeds what floating timeline logic can account for. The show establishes that Lois is 43 years old. This is confirmed in multiple episodes across multiple seasons. Her driver's license in one episode lists her physical measurements without a birth date, which is its own small anomaly, but her age of 43 is stated directly and consistently enough to function as settled canon. And simultaneously, the show places her at 18 years old in 1984, in flashback sequences that depict her as a teenager at the country club where she and Peter first met, jumping into the pool, living the kind of specific, late adolescent freedom that a specific period and a specific kind of wealthy American family produced. The episode Meet the Quagmires, in which Peter travels back in time to 1984, depicts Lois at that age, in that year, in concrete enough detail that the number is not ambiguous. She was 18 in 1984. If you calculate forward from that year to the present, she should be approaching 60. She is 43. Always 43. Frozen at that number, regardless of how many real-world years pass. The floating timeline explanation. The standard response to pointed questions about Family Guy's temporal consistency holds that the show deliberately maintains the characters at fixed ages to enable the series to run indefinitely, without the narrative complications that aging characters would create. This is a real and intentional production choice for many long-running animated series, and it is a completely adequate explanation for why characters do not visibly age or grow in the ordinary sense. But the theory does not dispute the floating timeline as a production choice. It asks what that production choice looks like from inside the show's own fictional universe, where the floating timeline is not a writer's room decision, but a feature of reality. And from inside that universe, a woman who's been 43 for 30 or more fictional years, whose contemporaries from 1984 should now be in their late 50s or early 60s, whose own mother Barbara is clearly older and does not share this property, is not simply a cartoon character held at a fixed age. She is someone to whom time is not applying in the way it applies to everyone around her. Lois's past contains a detail that the theory treats as the hinge point of this entire thread. She was, in her youth, extensively connected to the rock music world of the early 1980s. She had relationships with Gene Simmons of Kiss. She was involved at various points with Jay Giles, with Daryl Hall of Hall & Oates, with the pyrotechnic specialist from Whitesnake. These are confirmed in canonical cutaways across the show's run. She was a groupie, a participant in a world that was built around excess, around the deliberate invocation of transgression, around performances that drew on theatrical darkness in ways that Kiss, in particular, made central to their entire identity. Gene Simmons of Kiss built his stage persona around demonic imagery in a way that was, at the time of its peak, more thoroughgoing and more committed than almost any other popular entertainer. The makeup, the blood-spitting, the fire-breathing, the explicit invocation of demonic theatrics as the central aesthetic of his public identity. This was not casual Halloween costuming. This was a sustained, deliberate construction of a persona that trafficked in the language of the occult as its primary means of engaging with its audience. The theory does not claim that Gene Simmons is literally a supernatural entity. It claims that Lois Pewterschmidt, young and beautiful, and moving through that world at its most excessive peak, was a woman who was terrified of what she had seen happen to women in her family's social circle who got older, who watched her mother Barbara adapt and diminish? Who understood that in the world Carter Pewter Schmidt moved through, a woman's relevance was tied directly and mercilessly to her youth and appearance in ways that had no equivalent for the men in that world? And the theory proposes that at some point in the mid-1980s, through whatever access that particular world provided to whatever forces operate below the visible surface of things, Lois made a bargain. The terms of that bargain, as the theory reconstructs them from the evidence of her subsequent history, are approximately as follows. She would remain 43, not 25, not 30, 43, the age at which a woman who takes care of herself reaches a kind of peak integration of youth and maturity, the age that would feel permanent rather than temporary if it were the one that stopped moving. Time would pass around her, but not through her. She would not lose the face, or the body, or the social availability that she had seen disappear from the women around her. And the cost would be paid gradually, in increments, in pieces of the self that would be drained away across years of maintaining the arrangement. Pieces subtle enough that she would not notice each individual one going until enough had accumulated to make the change visible. For the first several seasons of Family Guy, Lois is the show's moral centre, patient with Peter in ways that exceed ordinary marital tolerance, warm toward her children in ways that anchor the family despite the chaos around them, capable of genuine affection, the person who holds the Griffin household together not through competence alone, but through actual emotional investment in the people in it. Then across the 8th through 21st seasons, something shifts. Not suddenly, not in a single episode, but across a slow accumulation of choices that diverge further and further from the character the first 7 seasons established. She tells Meg to commit suicide, not in the heat of an argument. Calmly, she packs Meg's school lunch with food scraps and a taunting photograph of herself eating properly. She casually mentions to Chris, in passing conversation, that she once killed a jaywalker. She tells him, as a statement of general parental wisdom, that every mother has killed someone. She is shown, in a flashback to her honeymoon with Peter, having killed a waitress to prove her love for him, presented not as a horror, but as a romantic memory. She cheats on Peter with multiple partners across multiple seasons and demonstrates no genuine remorse for any of it. She strangles Chris nearly to unconsciousness over a minor insult. She kidnaps multiple people across separate incidents when her expectations are not met. The warmth is gone, not all at once, in pieces, over many seasons, paid out incrementally in exactly the way the theory's proposed bargain would structure its payments. Her voice even changes across the run of the show. The vocal quality that the actress gives Lois shifts over time in ways that are subtle enough to be attributed to the ordinary evolution of a character across many years, but specific enough to register as a change in who is speaking. The pronunciation of Peter's name migrates from the ordinary version to something more compressed and wrong-sounding, a small but persistent indicator that something in the basic texture of how this person interfaces with her own life has been gradually altered. Season 22 brought a genuine shift in the other direction. Lois began behaving within individual episodes and across the arc of the season, more like the version of herself the show established in its first 7 seasons. Kinder to Meg, more genuinely present in her marriage, more capable of the warmth that the middle seasons had drained away from her. The standard reading is character rehabilitation, the show course-correcting a character that critics and audiences had been noting was no longer functioning as a protagonist the audience could root for. The theory's reading is different. It reads the season 22 shift not as a course correction, but as desperation, a last-ditch reclamation of enough humanity to change the terms of an arrangement that is approaching some kind of terminal payment. Whatever the bargain was, it has a limit. Every bargain of this kind has a limit, a point at which the accumulated cost resolves into a final demand. And if Lois has recognised that she is approaching that point, her sudden return to warmth and moral engagement is not character growth. It is an attempt to get back enough of what she gave away before the arrangement comes to collect everything that remains. Stewie once established, in the episode Lethal Weapons, that he had set a time bomb for Lois that would detonate on her 50th birthday. 50, the age she will never reach because the arrangement that has been keeping her at 43 has its own terminal logic, and that logic does not include allowing her to cross the threshold that would mean the contract expired in her favour. She will be 43 when the final payment comes due. She has been 43 for 30 years. She will be 43 for whatever years remain. And now, finally, there is the question that connects all of the threads we have followed tonight. Not a question about a specific character or a specific location, but a question about the entire context in which all of these people exist. A question about the laugh track. Family Guy is an animated series. It does not use a live studio audience. There is no physical space in which an assembled group of people watches the Griffins and reacts to what they observe in real time. The show was produced without a live audience, as virtually all animated series are, and the post-production process does not include the kind of audio sweetening that would add audience reactions to a show that was not designed to accommodate them. This is not a disputed fact. This is simply how the show works as a produced media object. And yet in specific episodes, across specific scenes, the show contains what can only be described as studio audience sound. Laughter, applause, the acoustic signature of a crowd of people reacting to something they are watching from a physical space that does not exist within the show's production context. This sound is present in a small number of episodes, not as background noise from a television that one of the characters is watching, not as part of a cutaway that frames itself as a show within the show, as diegetic sound in the Griffin family's reality, as actual acoustic phenomena occurring in the space where the characters exist. Peter Griffin, in the episode The Courtship of Stewie's Father, physically installs a live studio audience on Spooner Street. He brings bleachers, he arranges seating, he positions an assembled crowd outside his home. And then he starts making a joke to Brian, and he has to stop. He cannot continue speaking. The audience is laughing too loudly, and he has to wait for them to finish before he can deliver the rest of the sentence. He is aware of them. He hears them. He accommodates them by pausing his own speech until they are done. These are not invisible observers. These are entities that exist within the reality he inhabits. Beings that can perceive what he does, and whose responses create acoustic phenomena that he can hear. The theory around the laugh track begins with this observation and builds outward from it. What if the audience sound that occasionally appears in Family Guy is not a production anomaly or a joke about other shows that use laugh tracks? What if it is the show accurately representing something that the characters actually experience? The voices of entities from outside their universe, observing their existence from a higher dimensional plane, whose reactions to what they observe cross the dimensional boundary and become sound in the Griffin family's world. The show has confirmed that higher dimensional access to the Family Guy universe is possible. In the episode Road to the Multiverse, Stewie and Brian use a dimensional remote to visit multiple parallel realities. One of those realities is the actual live-action universe, a reality in which Brian and Stewie exist as flesh and blood physical beings rather than animated ones. They are there briefly and then return. The dimensional barrier between the animated universe and the real universe is permeable. They crossed it and came back, which means structurally that the barrier is permeable in both directions. If characters from inside the animated universe can access the world where real people live, then real people can observe the animated universe. And if millions of real people are simultaneously observing the Griffin family's existence in the same way you might observe a neighbour through a window, the combined perceptual weight of that observation, those millions of simultaneous witnesses, generates something. The theory holds that it generates sound, that it creates, on the other side of the dimensional membrane, an acoustic phenomenon that resembles nothing so much as a studio audience watching a live performance and reacting to what they see. In the 15th season episode Inside Family Guy, the show takes this further than it has ever taken it before by essentially making it explicit. The entire episode is structured as a behind-the-scenes documentary about the Griffin family as television performers. They have contracts. They know they are on a show. Peter is a difficult actor who quits every Monday and returns by Friday. Lois's orange hair is a wig. The family discusses their ratings, their network relationship, their ongoing existence as a media product whose continuation depends on the approval of people outside their world. This episode has been read as a meta-humor exercise, the show playfully breaking the fourth wall for an entire episode because it can, but the theory reads it as the show confirming a reality that the characters have always been aware of. They exist inside a structure that is observed from outside. They perform for an audience they cannot fully see or understand, and their continued existence depends on the sustained interest of higher dimensional beings who could, at any point, stop watching and cause their universe to cease to function. Peter Griffin addresses the camera directly in multiple episodes across the show's run. Not within cutaway frames, not within meta-humor segments that bracket the fourth wall break as a temporary formal device. He looks at the camera during scenes that are otherwise proceeding as normal narrative and talks to whoever is watching from the other side. He acknowledges their presence. He adjusts his behavior based on their perceived attention. He thanks them for watching, warns them away from intimate moments, expresses an awareness that the shape and direction of his life are not entirely within his own control, because the people who actually control them are not in Quahog. They are somewhere else, watching on a screen, and what he does depends to some degree on whether they find it worth continuing to observe. Stewie Griffin, in one episode, sings a song directly addressed to the Fox network, the real-world entity that airs Family Guy, asking them not to cancel the show. He delivers the song in the style of a genuine plea, a character within a fictional universe, appealing to the corporate entity from the real universe that decides whether his universe continues to exist. He looks up while he sings it. He looks at the ceiling, which from inside the animation is the border between his world and the world from which it is observed. He knows where the decisions about his existence come from. He cannot communicate directly with the people who make those decisions, but he can address them indirectly, look toward the place they are, and hope that whatever crosses the dimensional boundary is enough to move the outcome in a favourable direction. The show itself, in its most meta-aware moments, functions as an acknowledgement of something that the ordinary production context of an animated series does not require anyone to acknowledge. The people watching are not passive. They are part of the structure. They constitute an audience whose continued engagement is the condition of the show's existence, which from inside the show's universe looks like a condition of the character's existence, which is in practical terms exactly what it is. Every time someone watching Family Guy laughs at something that happens to one of the characters, the theory proposes that the character experiences something. Not a vision or a communication, an acoustic phenomenon, a sound from above, from wherever above is in the direction from which their universe is observed. A sound that does not announce itself as laughter because they have no framework for interpreting it as that, but which arrives as a kind of ambient confirmation that they are being watched, that their suffering or their confusion or their small moments of accidental dignity have been witnessed by something larger than themselves that exists outside their ability to access. And Peter Griffin, who has looked at the camera more often than any other character in the show's history, has been hearing that sound his entire life. He does not know what it is. He does not know what it comes from or what its source represents. but it is familiar to him. It is part of the texture of his existence in Quahog, a recurring acoustic phenomenon, unexplained, arriving at moments of comedy and pain and absurdity with equal indifference, neither approving nor condemning, simply present. He has learned to wait for it to finish before continuing to speak. There is something quietly devastating about that, if you let it land. A man who has been hearing the laughter of his audience his whole life, who has no framework for understanding what it is, who has simply learned to accommodate it as a feature of his reality, pausing in the middle of his own sentences to let an invisible presence finish its reaction before he continues. Not aware that he's performing, not aware that the sound he hears is the response of beings from outside his universe who find his pain funny. Just aware that sometimes you have to wait, that something in the air around him requires a pause before he can go on. There is one more thing about Peter Griffin that deserves its own space in this mythology, and it is something the show confirmed directly in one of its viewer mail segments in the 3rd season. Peter Griffin used a wish to remove every single bone from his body, not as a metaphor, not as a dream sequence. He made a wish to a genie, the wish was granted, and his entire skeleton disappeared. Every bone, his skull, his spine, his ribs, the entire structural framework that holds a human being in a recognizable upright shape and enables basic biological function. Gone. And he survived, not briefly, not for a few minutes of comedic spectacle before the consequences arrived to restore normal biology. He survived for an extended period as a conscious, speaking, experiencing entity with no skeletal structure at all. He was described in the episode as requiring 12 baths per day to maintain basic hygiene, suggesting that his body, in the boneless state, had a different metabolic relationship with its environment that produced waste or absorbed contamination at an accelerated rate. He travelled. He held conversations. He made decisions with enough complexity to indicate that his cognitive function was intact. He expressed emotions appropriate to his circumstances and demonstrated awareness of his situation, including the awareness that his condition was a burden on the people around him. He maintained his personality, his memories, and his fundamental character entirely throughout the period in which he had no bones. The biological problems with this are extensive enough that they warrant slowing down and moving through them deliberately, because the impossibility is not surface level, it is structural. Your skeleton does not only provide the framework that allows you to stand upright and move through space. Your rib cage protects your lungs and heart from being crushed by the physical environment around them, including the atmospheric pressure that exists at ground level and the weight of your own other organs and tissues pressing in from every direction. Your skull provides the only barrier between your brain and a world full of surfaces that would damage it on contact if it were simply floating in soft tissue with no protection. Your spine houses your spinal cord, which is the primary communication pathway between your brain and the rest of your body, the highway along which every motor signal and sensory signal must travel to allow anything below your neck to function. Your bones produce blood cells in their marrow and regulate calcium levels in ways that are not incidental to your survival, but central to it. Remove all of that, and what you have is not a boneless person. What you have is a biological crime scene. And yet Peter continues. His brain functions without the protection of a skull. His lungs breathe without the pressure differential that ribs create. His organs maintain their position and function without a skeletal structure to anchor them and prevent them from collapsing under their own weight and gravity. He accumulates dirt at an unusual rate and requires 12 baths per day, which is the one concession the show makes to the idea that his biology has changed in a boneless state, but otherwise he is entirely himself, present and functional and recognizable. He eventually travels to Los Angeles during this period by going down a bathtub drain. He passes through the plumbing system. He arrives at his destination. He finds employment as a human cushion for film stunt work, which requires the kind of consistent impact absorption that only works if the material being landed on maintains predictable structural integrity under repeated physical stress. Boneless Peter provides this consistently enough that he is employed for it, which means his body in the boneless state can regulate its physical properties without the skeletal structure that would normally be necessary to accomplish that regulation. The show provides the medical infrastructure for the resolution as well. Peter's family donates their own bones to a surgical procedure that reconstructs his skeleton. This should not work by any biological standard that applies to bone transplantation. Bones are custom-shaped to each individual's body, sized and structured to fit the specific muscles, joints, and connective tissues of the person they belong to. Transplanting random bones from different donors into a single recipient's body should result either in complete surgical failure or in catastrophic rejection, as the immune system responds to foreign biological material being incorporated into the body's architecture. Instead, the surgery succeeds, though with the cosmetic consequence that the griffins who donated bones are now misshapen from the loss. And Peter walks out of the hospital with a functional skeleton assembled from other people's structural components. His immune system accepts these foreign bones without significant complication. His body integrates them. His biology rebuilds around them as though the origin of the material is not a relevant variable in the integration process, which is either evidence that Peter's immune system does not function by the normal rules of transplant rejection, or evidence that his body's relationship with skeletal structure is sufficiently flexible that it does not distinguish between the bones it originally developed and bones from external sources, provided the geometric requirements for function are approximately met. What the boneless period reveals, when you read it through the framework of the Griffin gene mutation theory, is not a cartoon joke about a wish gone wrong. It is an accidental demonstration of how different Peter Griffin's biology actually is from standard human biology. The wish did not create an impossible situation and then cartoon logic it away. It removed a system component from a body that turned out not to require that component for basic survival, demonstrated the specific ways in which the body adapted to its absence, and then showed how the component could be replaced through a process that ordinary human biology would have rejected entirely. Peter did not survive the boneless period through luck or cartoon convention. He survived it because his body's relationship with its own structural requirements is not the same as an ordinary human body's relationship with those requirements. The wish revealed the flexibility that was always there. The mutation that comes from decades of environmental toxic exposure in Quahog is not just cosmetic and not just cognitive. It goes all the way down to the biological foundation of how the Griffin family's bodies actually work. The show has never needed to explain any of this explicitly because the combination of cartoon logic and episodic structure provides adequate cover for individual, impossible events. But when you hold them all together, the survival of fatal injuries, the exposure to toxic waste-producing mutation rather than illness, the boneless period, the cognitive extremes in the male line, the healing rate, the general biological resilience that the entire family demonstrates across 23 seasons, they accumulate into a single, coherent picture. The Griffins are not biologically ordinary. They have not been biologically ordinary for generations, and the town they live in has been producing the conditions for that departure from ordinary biology since before any of them were born. Now consider, as a final thread before we reach the end of tonight's exploration, what it would mean if everything that happens in Quahog is being managed in a more active and more deliberate way than even the Pewter-Schmidt dynasty or the containment structures on Spooner Street can account for. What if the reset that the town experiences after every catastrophe, the way major disasters and transformative events fail to accumulate in the collective memory of the population, is not simply a feature of cartoon narrative convention, but a function of active management through a specific mechanism, what if someone, or something, has direct access to the perceptions and memories of every resident of Quahog, and has been using that access to shape what they know and remember and believe? In the episode April in Quahog, the anchors of Channel 5 News broadcast a fake report claiming that a black hole is approaching Earth and that the world will end within 24 hours. The information is false. The anchors know it is false. They broadcast it anyway, as what they later describe as an April Fool's joke, and Quahog's response is total and immediate. The entire town collapses into chaos within hours. People abandon their moral frameworks completely. Lawlessness spreads, and across the town, 87 people die by suicide rather than wait for the end that Tom Tucker and Diane Simmons told them was coming. When the prank is revealed, the anchors appear on camera to describe the results with satisfaction. The 87 deaths are presented as acceptable evidence of a successful joke. No charges are filed. No investigation occurs. Channel 5 continues to operate as Quahog's primary news source as though nothing happened. The theory around Channel 5 does not begin with the April Fool's incident, but that incident is where its implications become impossible to explain with ordinary media influence. What the April Fool's broadcast demonstrates is not that the people of Quahog are unusually credulous or unusually susceptible to panic. It is that their capacity to resist a Channel 5 broadcast does not exist. 87 people heard Tom Tucker tell them the world was ending and immediately made the decision to end their own lives rather than wait. These are not people who panicked and then, in the panic, made a catastrophic decision. These are people whose minds arrived at a conclusion the moment the broadcast provided it, and followed that conclusion to its end point without the intervention of any countervailing thought. Their survival instinct, the most fundamental biological drive a living organism has, was overridden by a single television broadcast. That is not gullibility, that is programming. Tom Tucker and Diane Simmons are not the architects of this system. The theory holds that they are its instruments, its delivery mechanism, the voices through which a signal that originates somewhere in the Channel 5 infrastructure reaches the minds of everyone in Quahog who is exposed to the broadcast. The anchors appear to believe they are journalists. They appear to experience their work as ordinary news production. The manipulation is embedded in the broadcast itself, in the frequencies or patterns or whatever technical mechanism the theory proposes is present in every Channel 5 transmission, subtle enough that the people delivering it cannot perceive it, consistent enough to reach every television-owning household in the greater Quahog area. The resets the town experiences after catastrophes are Channel 5 managing its territory. The disasters accumulate, the consequences pile up, and then Tom Tucker appears at the news desk and delivers a broadcast that replaces what the population remembers with what they are supposed to remember. The show treats this as the genre convention of episodic television. The theory reads it as the show's most precise description of how Quahog actually works, through a news operation that does not report reality but manufactures it, edition by edition, for a population that has been configured to accept what it is given without retaining what it already knew. The Channel 5 situation has a second layer that the theory treats as even more significant than the April Fool's broadcast itself. It is the response to the revelation. Tom Tucker and Diane Simmons appeared on camera after the prank was confirmed to brag about its success. They named the number of deaths. They described the citywide chaos with visible satisfaction. And then the broadcast ended, and Quahog moved on. Brian Griffin, the character who most often functions as the show's moral voice, called them a pair of unpleasant people. That was the strongest response anyone in Quahog was capable of producing to a public announcement in which local news anchors celebrated having caused nearly 100 deaths. The fact that Brian's response was so muted is worth dwelling on. Brian is not a muted character. He argues, he challenges, he takes positions with force and holds them under pressure. He has, across the show's run, demonstrated genuine moral outrage at injustices large and small. But in response to a public celebration of 87 deaths caused by a deliberate lie, he managed a mild insult, and then the subject was closed. The theory does not read this as Brian being written inconsistently for comedic purposes. It reads it as the broadcast signal working on Brian in its attenuated form. He is smarter than most of the people around him. He is also, as a dog, working through a biology that may be partially resistant to whatever mechanism the broadcasts use. So he can perceive that something is wrong. He cannot sustain the full weight of what is wrong for long enough to act on it. The signal is less effective on him, but it is not without effect. And the most chilling implication of the Channel 5 theory is the one that connects it back to everything else we have covered tonight. The Pewter-Schmidt dynasty controls media infrastructure in ways the show confirms directly, through Carter's poker table access to network executives and through Pewter-Schmidt Industries' tentacles into telecommunications and broadcasting. The containment structures on Spooner Street require that their subjects remain unaware of what they are contained within. Mayor West's meta-awareness is managed by ensuring no one in Quahog takes his accurate observations seriously. Dr. Hartman's monitoring of the Griffin family requires that the family not understand they are being monitored. Every thread in this mythology depends, at its operational core, on the population of Quahog not accumulating enough information to understand what their town actually is. Channel 5 is the mechanism that ensures they do not. Not through conspiracy, not through active censorship, not through anything visible enough to generate resistance. Through the ordinary routine of the evening news, broadcast into every home in the city, managing the collective memory of an entire population on behalf of interests that have never needed to announce themselves, because the management has been so thorough and so consistent that the people being managed have never needed to be told what to forget. They forget automatically. The next broadcast handles it. Peter Griffin watches Channel 5 every night. His family watches Channel 5. His neighbours watch Channel 5. The entire infrastructure of what they believe to be true about their world, their history, their memories of the catastrophes that have passed through Quahog and the people who caused them, runs through the same signal that told 87 people to end their lives and then celebrated the result on the 11 o'clock news. And Peter, sitting on the green couch in the house that Carter Pewter-Schmidt owns, with the door that resets and the address that does not exist on any map, with his mutated genetics and his impossible biology, and his wife who is paying down a supernatural debt in pieces of her own humanity, watches the news and feels, in some part of himself that is too deep for conscious awareness to reach, entirely certain that everything is fine, that this is normal, that the town he lives in is exactly what it appears to be, that the laughter he occasionally hears, unexplained, coming from somewhere above him, is simply part of the ambient texture of his life and does not require any further examination. He has learned not to examine the things that do not resolve. There are a lot of those things in Quahog. There have always been a lot of those things in Quahog. The management depends on that tolerance for unresolved strangeness, on the particular brand of incuriosity that lets a man notice without further thought that his house was destroyed last week and is fine this week, that his daughter has 2 different birth stories, that his father-in-law owns the house he lives in and also owned his ancestors, that a news broadcast occasionally sounds like an audience laughing at him from somewhere he cannot locate. He notices these things and moves on. Not because he is stupid, though the test results suggest he is closer to that end of the spectrum than the other, but because the system is very good at what it does, and what it does is make the impossible feel like the background of ordinary life, and ordinary life feel like the only reality anyone could reasonably expect to inhabit. The dynasty built the cage. The contamination mutated the inhabitants. The management structure maintains the illusion. And the audience, watching from outside the dimensional membrane, keeps generating that sound that drifts across the boundary and lands in Peter Griffin's living room as something he cannot name, but has always been able to hear. He has never asked what it is. He has never had a reason to. He lives in a house that heals itself, in a town that forgets its own history, inside a mythology that has been quietly assembling itself in the background of a show about nothing in particular for more than 25 years. And every night he watches the news, and the signal does its work, and tomorrow he will not remember most of what happened today, except in the way that suits the people who decide what gets remembered in Quahog. The mythology of this town is not visible from the surface. It was never designed to be. It was designed to be invisible, self-maintaining, perpetually plausible, hidden in plain sight inside a television show that most of its audience has always assumed was too chaotic to contain anything this deliberate. That assumption is the last line of the management structure, the one that keeps the whole thing running. And we, tonight, watching from outside the membrane, generating the sound they hear as a distant laugh track, are the one part of this system that has never had to be managed. Because we were always the ones doing the watching, and we were never supposed to notice that they could hear us. What we have traced tonight across the full span of the Quahog mythology is a series of systems that work in concert with each other in ways that none of them could sustain independently. The dynasty provides the financial infrastructure and the political insulation that allows everything else to operate without being disrupted from outside. The contamination provides the biological differentiation that makes the Griffin family and the wider population of Quahog something other than ordinary people in an ordinary town, a differentiation so gradual and so embedded in the environment that no one who lives inside it can perceive it from the inside. The containment structures on Spooner Street provide the residential framework through which the most anomalous individuals can be maintained in a condition of functional unawareness, housed in spaces that repair themselves, surrounded by managed social infrastructure that keeps the impossible from appearing impossible to the people who are living it. The broadcast mechanism provides the ongoing memory management that prevents the accumulated evidence from becoming legible to the people it surrounds. And the audience watching from outside all of it provides the observation pressure that keeps the whole structure from collapsing into itself. Because a universe being watched is a universe that needs to maintain the coherence required for watching. The laugh track is not a joke, it is a load-bearing wall. Every time Peter Griffin survives something he should not survive, every time a consequence evaporates before it lands, every time the house resets and the town forgets and the management does its invisible work, there is an acoustic confirmation of the process. The observers from outside the membrane are still watching. The universe is still coherent enough to observe. The signal from the laugh track tells the characters, in the only language available to them for this particular communication, that they are still being seen, and that being seen means continuing to exist. Take away the audience, and you take away the condition of coherence that holds the animated universe together. The Griffins do not just hear the laugh track. In a real sense that neither they nor we fully understand, they need it. And we, sitting on the other side of the membrane, watching and laughing and generating that sound that crosses the boundary into their world, are the most powerful structural element in their mythology, more powerful than Carter Pewterschmidt, more powerful than whatever Lois bargained with, more powerful than whatever is managing the population through the evening news. We are the thing the whole system is built around. The audience that everything in Quahog is arranged to keep watching and keep laughing and keep providing the acoustic confirmation that the universe is still running. We have always been part of this, and the show has been telling us so in plain sight for 25 years. In every meta-joke and fourth wall break and moment where Peter looks at the camera, in every theory that the show plants and never explains and leaves sitting in the official record for anyone paying close enough attention to find, in the accumulated weight of a mythology that was built not to be seen from the surface, but to be found, slowly, by the people who were already watching closely enough to hear the sound they were making from the other side. We take our time with the dark things. We always have. That is where we end tonight. Not with a resolution, because none of these theories resolve. They accumulate. The Pewter-Schmidt dynasty built its infrastructure quietly enough that the people inside it only see pieces of it at any given time. Meg carries a father's name that she never heard spoken aloud in the moment it mattered. Brian is running a countdown that he cannot see. Glenn is living in a body he shares with someone he cannot speak to. Mayor West has been shouting the truth about his reality into a room where no one is listening. Death is punching the clock. The griffins are mutating by degrees in a town that is still poisoning them. The house resets every time it comes too close to the truth about itself. Lois is paying installments on a bargain she made when she was 22 and terrified of getting old. And somewhere above all of it, above the cartoon suburb with its impossible residents and its resetting house and its managed mayor and its franchise death, there is an audience watching, laughing, generating a sound that crosses the dimensional membrane and arrives in Quahog as something the characters cannot name but have always been able to hear. The mythology of Family Guy is not a separate thing from the show's surface content. It is the architecture underneath the surface content, visible when you slow down and look at what the show actually says rather than what you remember it saying. The details are real, the episodes exist, the lines were spoken, the choices were made by writers who understood what they were building, at least in pieces, and who have been adding to it for 25 years without ever needing to announce what they were doing, because the audience that would have heard the announcement was wearing headphones. We take our time with the dark things. That is the only honest way to look at them. Sleep well. Quahog will still be there when you wake up.